Seraphine had learned, somewhere between her first year of marriage and her second, that the safest place in a palace was the edge of every room, not the corner. Corners were for hiding, and hiding was noticed. The edge was different. The edge was where people put furniture they weren't sure what to do with, decorative chairs nobody sat in, side tables holding candles that never got lit. You could stand at the edge and look like you belonged to the room without the room ever needing to claim you back. She had gotten very good at this. 14 months of marriage to the Alpha King, and she had the edge of every room in the Dre Palace memorized. She knew which floors creaked. She knew which windows let in a draft that smelled like pine and wet stone. She knew that the grand dining hall had a column on the left side, third from the entrance, that created a blind spot large enough for one person standing with their shoulders slightly inward. She had spent a lot of time in that blind spot. This is not a sad thing to admit, she had decided. This is just information. The Luna mark had come 14 months ago, at the bonding ceremony, in front of 400 people who had dressed for the occasion in the pale silver that the Pax tradition required. Seraphine had stood at the front of the chamber in a gown that wasn't hers, borrowed from the royal wardrobe, fitted by a seamstress who did the job with the polite efficiency of someone completing a task and asking no questions about it. And she had pressed her palm flat to Kaylin's wrist. The mark burned itself into the inside of her left wrist in under 3 seconds. The crowd made a sound. Kaylin looked at the mark and then looked at her and smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had probably made things happen for him his entire life. Doors opening, people softening, whole rooms tilting in his direction like plants toward a very confident sun. She had felt chosen. She had been so sure of it, standing there with her wrist on fire and her heart doing something embarrassing in her chest. 400 people witnessed it. The mark was real. The magic was real. The ceremony was real. She had just not understood, yet, that a real mark on a real wrist meant almost nothing about what happened in the rooms that followed. The thing about Kaylin was that he was not cruel in the way people warned you about. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't take things away. He didn't humiliate her at state dinners, or contradict her in front of guests, or make her feel, in any direct and documentable way, that she was not wanted. He just operated like she was on a slightly different frequency, present in the room, inaudible. She attended every function. She stood at the correct angle to his left, the Luna's position, which she had studied, which she had practiced, which she could hold for 4 hours without her expression doing anything it wasn't supposed to. She wore the correct colors. She smiled at the correct moments. She learned the names of all the council members' wives and asked them about their children with genuine interest, because she liked them even if nobody had told her she needed to. She told herself, on the nights when the palace felt too large and too quiet, that this was just how it was at the beginning. That Kaylin was busy, that a king had things to carry, that she was new to this and the newness would wear off, and then there would be more of something, more of anything. She told herself this for 14 months. She was very practiced at telling herself things. She was not supposed to be in the East Corridor on a Thursday evening. The East Corridor was technically part of her territory as Luna. All corridors were. Technically, all rooms, technically, which was a kind of power that felt like being told you owned the ocean and then finding out you weren't allowed to touch the water. But in practice, the East Corridor was where Kaylin's private offices were, and she had learned without being told that the private offices were not for her. She was there because of a book. This is the specific, stupid detail she would return to later. The book. A collection of old border territory histories, dry as sand, exactly the kind of thing nobody else in the palace would want, which was why she had been quietly borrowing it from the royal archive for 3 months, taking it, reading it, slipping it back before anyone noticed it was gone, and then taking it again 2 days later. It was a small and harmless theft, and the archive staff either hadn't noticed or had decided not to care. She had left it in the corridor that morning by accident. She went back for it on Thursday evening. This is why she was there. This is the fact she could not stop returning to. Later, in the same way your tongue finds a sore tooth, not because the returning helped anything, but because the mind needs somewhere to put the weight of a thing it can't carry straight on. She heard Kalen's voice before she turned the corner. She stopped. Not because she was trying to eavesdrop, because her body stopped, because there was something in the sound of his voice, lower than his public voice, looser, that made her understand before her brain had finished the thought that she was about to hear something that was not meant for her. She should have turned around. She would think about this later too. Isolde was laughing. Not the laugh she used at state dinners. That one was polished and aimed, like a piece of jewelry worn for effect. This one was different, unself-conscious. The laugh of someone who believed completely that there was no one around who mattered. Seraphine heard her own name. It was a small thing, the way Isolde said it. Compact. The way you say a word you've decided is slightly beneath you. Not enough contempt to make it sharp, just enough to make it small. Then something about the Luna mark. 2 sentences, maybe 3. Seraphine caught the shape of them more than the exact words, the way you catch a smell on the wind and understand what it is before you've identified the source. Something about the mark and what it said about Kalen's taste. Something about the difference between what tradition required and what a man actually wanted. Seraphine waited for Kalen to say something. He did. He agreed with the shape of it. Not loudly. He never did anything loudly, but he agreed, and there was something almost relaxed in the way he did it. The voice of a man in a room where he didn't have to manage anything. Seraphine stood in the corridor. The wall at the end of it was gray stone, the same gray stone as every other wall in this palace. And there was a crack in the mortar near the floor. She had never noticed it before. Maybe 2 inches long, running slightly diagonal. The kind of crack that had been there for years and would be there for years more. Structural enough to not matter, present enough to be real. She looked at the crack. She thought, I have been very good at not noticing things. She turned around, walked back, counted her own steps without meaning to. Something her body did when it needed to put numbers between itself and a feeling. 17 steps to her corridor, 11 more to her room. She opened the door, closed it behind her, stood with her back to it for a moment. Her room was very clean. She was a tidy person, always had been. There was something about disorder that made the inside of her chest feel like a room with furniture pushed against the wrong walls. She sat on the edge of her bed. The mark on her wrist was warm, the way it sometimes got, without any apparent reason. She looked at it. The crescent and chain design, dark against the inside of her left wrist, permanent as bone. She thought, very clearly, for the first time, I am not staying. She did not leave dramatically. This was a choice, though it didn't feel like one at the time. It felt more like the natural shape of who she was. The same woman who had stood at the edge of every room, who had learned to take up the minimum of space, who had never once in 14 months thrown something, or raised her voice, or made Kalen sit with any discomfort that was actually hers. She did not confront him. She did not leave a letter on his pillow, or blow through his office door, or stand in the great hall and say the things she had overheard in front of the 400 people who had witnessed her mark. She had no interest in performing her own pain for an audience. She had done enough performing. She left on a Tuesday morning. This felt right. Tuesdays were council days, a 3-hour block of trade negotiations that she had attended 63 times across the past 14 months and had been spoken to directly in exactly 0 of them. She went to the council chamber, stood at the edge for the opening formalities, and then walked out during the first recess, the way she sometimes did, the way that nobody ever tracked because why would they track what she did? She went to her room, packed one bag, took the things that were hers, not the things the palace had given her, not the gowns from the royal wardrobe or the jewelry from the formal collection, just the small, real things. The book, obviously. She took the book, some writing tools. The boots she had brought with her 14 months ago that had gone unworn because they were the wrong kind for palace floors. She signed her own travel papers. She was the Luna. She had that authority, technically. One of the very few real pieces of it they had left her with, and she used it now with the flat efficiency of someone completing a task. The mark on her wrist was warm the whole time she packed. She did not look at it. She was on the eastern road before noon. The dragon-blooded king's territory did not look the way the court had described it. The court had said, primitive, isolated. A holdover from before the proper pack structure, which was another way of saying inferior, which was another way of saying not like us, which she had learned to parse for what it actually meant versus what it said. What she found was old trees, the older kind, with trunks wide enough that you could put your arms around them and not feel the other side. Roads that were maintained without being manicured, no decorative stone borders, no ornamental plantings, just packed earth that did its job without asking to be admired for it. The border was marked by a ridge of dark stone, low and natural, and when her traveling cart crested it, the air changed, not dramatically, not in the way stories describe crossings of important thresholds, no sudden chill, no held breath in the world, just a shift in the way the light was hitting things, a different quality of afternoon. The capital was smaller than she had expected, not poor, not crude, just proportioned differently. Buildings that were built to be used rather than to be looked at. A market that ran in a circle rather than a grid, which seemed inefficient until she spent an hour in it and realized that the circular layout meant you always ended up back where you started, which was actually very practical if you forgot where you'd parked your cart. She was brought to the palace, which was less a palace and more a very large, very old building that had the weight of permanence about it. The kind of place that had been standing long enough that it had stopped trying to impress anyone. Zoran Ashvale did not come to greet her. His seneschal did. A woman in her 50s with gray at her temples and the posture of someone who had processed a great many unusual situations without losing her footing in any of them. She looked at Seraphine, and then at the single bag, and then at the travel papers, and then back at Seraphine, and said, "The king has prepared the ambassador's suite. Not the guest wing, not the servant quarters, the ambassador's suite, which was a category all its own, the room for people who occupied a space the building didn't have an existing word for." Seraphine thought, "That's fair." She took the room. She asked for work on her third day. The seneschal's expression did not change, which was itself an expression. She said that the dragon-blooded king's court did not typically assign labor to guests, certainly not to guests of Seraphine's. Here she paused, selecting the word carefully. Standing. Seraphine said she understood. Then she went and found the archive. It was on the second floor, past a hall of maps so old their edges had gone soft, in a long room with windows that faced north and let in a steady, indirect light that was perfect for reading. The archive was substantial and almost entirely uncatalogued. Shelves of material organized, she quickly determined, by a system that appeared to have been invented by someone who actively preferred things to be difficult to find. She sat down at the end table. She started working. Nobody came to stop her. This either meant the staff had decided to allow it or that nobody had yet noticed. Either way, it didn't matter. She had her book, she had the archive, and she had a task her hands could do while the rest of her sorted through the large, quiet wreckage of the past several weeks. Zoran Ashvale found her in the archive on her fourth day. She heard him before she saw him. Boots on old wood, unhurried, the sound of someone who knew where they were going and wasn't in a rush about it. She kept her eyes on the document she was cataloging, because she had learned that looking up when someone entered a room gave them a certain power over the moment, and she had given enough of those away. He sat at the other end of the table. She cataloged. He read. After 40 minutes, he left. She looked up after he was gone, looked at the chair he had used, looked at the documents he had returned to the correct shelf. She could tell because he had put them back in the system she had been building, not the one that had existed before, which meant he had looked at her labels and used them. She turned back to her work. He came the next day, and the day after. He was not what she had expected. The court's gossip had given her a rough outline. Half wolf, half dragonkin, the strange hybrid result of an alliance between two bloodlines that didn't usually mix. They said he was volatile, territorial, difficult to read. They said the dragonkin blood made him run hot, which they seemed to mean both literally and as a criticism. What she found was someone who did not speak to fill silence. This seemed like a small thing. It was not a small thing. She had spent 14 months in Kalen's court, where silence was a kind of currency, where what wasn't said was always pointing at something, always performing, always requiring her to interpret and respond and manage the space around it. Silence with Kaylin was a room she had to furnish. Zoran's silences were not empty. He was simply there, reading, thinking, occasionally making a note in the margin of something. He existed at the other end of the table with the untroubled presence of someone who had decided long ago that he did not need to justify his occupation of a space. She found this, the first week, actually somewhat difficult to sit with. She kept waiting for the silence to need something from her. It didn't. She eventually stopped waiting. His shoulder carried a scar that started at the curve of his neck and ended somewhere below his collar. Wide and pale, the kind that came from something significant, the kind that had a story she would not ask about, not because she wasn't curious, but because she understood that some stories were not on offer, and it was not her place to put her hand out for them uninvited. His hands were large, ink-stained on the right usually. He was left-handed when he wrote, but reached with his right, which meant his dominant hand was the one he used to think with, not to do things with. She had noticed this by the second week, and had made herself stop noticing it by the third, because she was aware that cataloging a person's physical details was not cataloging. He spoke rarely. When he did, it counted. One afternoon, she had been there 3 weeks and 3 days. Not that she was counting, she was just aware of time, the way you're aware of weather. He looked up from the ledger he was reviewing and said, "You've reorganized the eastern border section." She said, "It was filed under miscellaneous." Miscellaneous is where organization goes to die. He looked at her for a moment. He said, "The man who organized this archive for 40 years would be upset to hear that." She said, "I imagine he organized it this way to make himself indispensable." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite agreement, but was probably both. He went back to the ledger. She went back to the catalog. The mark on her wrist was warm. She told herself it was the room. Kaylin arrived 6 weeks after she left. 4 guards, a formal crest on the carriage. The kind of entrance that announced itself before it arrived, which told her everything she needed to know about the mood he was bringing. Angry people came alone and fast. Embarrassed people came with witnesses and protocols, because witnesses and protocols meant the moment was official rather than personal, which meant they couldn't be blamed for how they handled it. She received him in the small receiving room on the ground floor, not the great hall, not anywhere with an audience, because she had no interest in making this a performance. He looked exactly the same. That was the thing about him. He always looked exactly the same. Controlled, clean-lined, the kind of face that had learned very young how to show only what it intended. He said her name. She waited. He said things about the mark, about what it represented, about tradition, about the appearance of things, about duty. He said them the way he said most things, with the practiced fluency of someone who had prepared for the conversation in advance and knew what shape he wanted it to take. He was very good at this. She had always known he was very good at this. She let him finish. Then she said, "I was in the East Corridor on a Thursday evening." That was all. She did not list what she had heard. She did not describe Isolde's laugh. She did not say the words that had been said about the mark, about her, about the quiet contempt that lived in the voice of a man speaking to someone he believed couldn't hear him. She compressed the whole of it into one sentence, 7 words, because she had learned from 14 months of his court that the minimum viable unit of truth was the one that couldn't be argued with. He was quiet. She watched him understand. Then she watched him calculate. She could see it, the slight shift behind his eyes, the assessment of what options existed, whether there was a way to manage this, whether she could be brought back into a shape that was useful to him. She let him finish calculating too. Then she said, "You can go." He stood there for a moment longer than he needed to, which was the only version of discomfort she was ever going to get from him, and she accepted it as enough. He left. She stood at the window of the ambassador's suite afterward and watched his carriage move through the courtyard. 4 guards. Formal crest. The whole thing moving with the smooth efficiency of an institution that had never once had to reckon with the possibility of being left by the person it had decided didn't matter enough to need. She watched until the carriage was gone. She felt, not what she thought she would feel. She felt correct, like a piece of furniture that had been against the wrong wall for 14 months and had finally been moved. What happened with Zoran did not happen the way these things are supposed to happen. There was no declaration, no moment in the rain, no speech. He was not the kind of man who stood in doorways making speeches, and even if he had been, she was not at a place yet where she could have received one without doing something embarrassing like walking away from it. What there was, the archive, every day, the north-facing windows and the steady light, and the table long enough that two people could work at it without being in each other's way. What there was, his habit of pushing the second cup of whatever he was drinking to her side of the table when he poured his own, without asking, without making it into a gesture, just doing it. The way you do things for people you have stopped thinking of as guests and started thinking of as people. What there was, the way he asked her opinion on things, not ceremonially, not the way the court at Kalen's palace had sometimes asked for her perspective when they needed a woman's face attached to a decision, as decoration, as legitimizing prop. He asked her the way he asked his council members, with the same weight in the asking, the same waiting in the pause that followed, the same actual listening when she spoke. She had not realized, until it happened, how long it had been since someone had listened like that. The first time she caught herself thinking about this, she was in the archive, and he was not there, and she was sitting with her pen held above a document she had stopped reading, and the realization arrived with the flat clarity of something true. She sat with that for a while. Then she finished cataloging. The mark activated the first time 7 weeks in. She would not have had a word for it, except that she had read enough about Luna marks in the old archive texts to understand what was happening when it happened. She had even cataloged the relevant section herself, 3 weeks earlier, with the private irony of someone who had not yet known why the information would matter. He handed her a document, a routine exchange, both of them reviewing the same border correspondence from different angles, passing papers back and forth across the table. His fingers brushed the inside of her wrist. Not intentionally, not even closely intentionally. He was handing her papers. She was taking them. The contact lasted less time than it takes to register. The mark burned, not painfully, the way something burns when it wakes up. She put the documents down carefully. She said, "Excuse me a moment." She walked into the hallway and stood with her back against the cold stone and looked at her wrist. The mark was lit, not visibly, not to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but she could feel it, the way you feel a word on the tip of your tongue, present, and almost painful in its almostness. She thought about what the archive texts had said. The mark responded to recognition, not possession, not rank, not ceremony. Recognition, the specific, simple fact of being seen by someone who looked at you as if you were a full and complete thing, as if your presence in the room was a given rather than a conditional. She stood in the hallway for a while, then she went back in and continued working. She stopped being careful about it sometime around the 3rd month. Not loudly, not in a way that announced itself. It was more that she stopped the internal work of keeping a certain kind of distance, the constant low-level management of being in a room with someone who might notice her noticing him. She let herself notice things. She let herself notice that he was unhurried in a way that had nothing to do with being slow. He was fast, actually, faster than anyone in his court, at seeing the shape of a problem and finding the lever point in it, but he moved through decisions without the theatrical pressure of a man performing urgency. He did things because they needed doing, and he did them at the pace they required. She let herself notice that he was honest in a way that was sometimes abrupt and occasionally inconvenient, and that she found this, she searched for the right word, restful. She had spent 14 months managing the implications of what things meant, interpreting the gap between what Kalen said and what he intended, reading rooms and silences, and the exact degree of warmth in a given smile. It was constant work. She had done it so automatically that she had not known it was work until she stopped doing it. She stopped doing it here. She said what she thought. He responded to what she actually said, not to some political calculation behind it. When he disagreed with her, he said so directly and told her why. When he agreed with her, he said that too, the same way, with no additional performance attached. She thought, one afternoon, watching him work through a ledger with the focused patience of someone who genuinely needed the numbers to be right. This is what it is supposed to feel like. She didn't say it out loud. She went back to the catalog. The second time the mark activated was different. It was not accidental. It was not a brush of fingers over paper. It was an evening, late, the archive gone dark around the edges, and both of them too absorbed to have noticed the light changing, and she had handed him a document, and he had taken it, and he had looked up. At her. Not at the document. At her. Not with calculation or assessment, or the particular look of someone deciding what she was worth, or what she needed from him. Just looking. The simple animal fact of one person looking at another person and not looking away. The mark burned so clearly that she was sure he could see it. He looked at her wrist. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I don't know what that means for you." She said, "I don't either." He said, "We can figure it out later." And then he handed her the next document in the stack. She took it. Her hands were steady. She did not know then that later was the greatest gift anyone had given her in a very long time. The gift of a thing being allowed to exist without being forced into a shape, without being managed or resolved or decided before it was ready. Just later. A door left open, a question allowed to be a question. She held it the way you hold something you don't want to crush. The 4th month. The council chamber had a table long enough for 12 people, and she had been sitting at it for 3 weeks now. Not at the edge. Not in the observer's chair along the wall, which had been her instinct when she was first invited. The instinct of someone who had learned that invitation and inclusion were not the same thing, and had gotten very good at sitting in the space between them. Zoran had looked at her when she moved toward the observer's chair and said, "That's not where you sit." He'd said it the way you say a simple fact. She had sat at the table. She was there the afternoon someone asked her, directly, by name, a council member named Ferris who handled the Eastern correspondence and had apparently noticed the reorganization of the archive because it had made his work significantly easier, about the filing patterns she had built for the border treaties. She answered. She answered clearly, specifically, with the confidence of someone who knew the material because she had spent 4 months living inside it, and when she was finished, the conversation continued, and her input was part of it, woven in, used, built on. She looked down at her hands on the table. The mark was warm. She thought, very quietly, in a part of herself she had stopped showing to rooms a long time ago. Oh, so this is what it was marking. Not her worth to someone else. Not her place in a ceremony. Not the thing she had to be in order to justify taking up space. Just this. Her, at the table, speaking, being heard. The council moved to the next item. She turned the page. There is no single moment that explains what she became in the dragon-blooded king's court, because becoming is not a single moment. It is a long and quiet accumulation of small choices. To speak, to stay, to stop apologizing for needing the answer to be better than it was. To stop standing at the edge of rooms that she was allowed to walk into. She was not the same woman who had stood in the East Corridor on a Thursday evening with her back against the cold and her eyes on a crack in the mortar. She was not trying to be. That woman had done what needed doing, had packed one bag, had signed her own papers, had walked out a door and not looked back for someone to chase her. That woman was not weak. She had just been in a room that was the wrong size for her actual body. The ambassador's suite had become something else. Nobody had renamed it. Nobody needed to. Zoran had asked her one evening what she planned to do about the Eastern treaty records that were currently split between 3 different cataloging systems, one of his, one of the previous archivists, and one she had apparently invented herself somewhere around month 2 without fully realizing she was doing it. She had said, "I'll consolidate them. Give me a week." He had said, "Take 2, do it right." She had taken 9 days and done it right, and brought him the finished system on a Thursday evening, and he had read it at the table across from her, with the same quiet attention he brought to everything, and at the end of it he had said, "This is better than anything we've had." She had said, "I know." He had looked up. She had not looked away. The mark on her wrist was warm. The window was dark. The archive was quiet. The north-facing light was gone for the night, and the candles they'd lit 2 hours ago were burning low, and there was a document she hadn't finished yet, and she would finish it, probably, or she would start it fresh in the morning. And either way the archive would be there, and the table would be there, and the chair at the other end would be occupied by someone who had decided without announcement or ceremony that she was allowed to simply be. She thought about the East Corridor. She thought about Kaylin's voice, loose and unguarded, saying her name the way you say a word you've decided doesn't matter anymore. She thought about a crack in gray stone mortar, 2 inches long, slightly diagonal, the kind of thing that had been there for years without being fixed, because it wasn't the kind of damage anyone needed to fix, just the kind of thing that happened to walls that were standing for a long time in a place that had seasons. She thought, I am not that corridor. She thought, I am not the crack. She turned to the document she hadn't finished. She began,